Responding first this evening, we're very, very fortunate to have Dr. Amy Robertson. Amy is Director of Lifelong Learning at Congregation Or Hadash in Sandy Springs. I'm proud to say that my wife and I are founding members of the synagogue that's now 20 congregation that's 20 years old. She's had 15 years of Jewish education and Jewish communal experience. She's worked in synagogues, camps, and day school settings. Amy is articulate. Amy is committed to Jewish Israel education. She's worked in Reform, Reconstructionist, and conservative movements. Jay Schaefer is a 2021 graduate of Harvard Law School with honors. He was deputy editor of the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Diplomacy. In 2018, he graduated from Emory with honors in history. In this fall and spring, he will be a law clerk for 2 different judges, an indication of the meritorious nature in which judges consider his intellect and his potential as a lawyer. During his last year at Emory University, he undertook an honors with us, with me in particular, and he wrote on the Arab-Israeli negotiating process from 77 to 79, and he was an intern for the Center for Israel Education. Lastly, but not least, we are indebted to Jackie Weiss for being with us here this evening. Not only is she a recent Emory undergraduate, having graduated in May 2021 with a BA in Human Health and minor in Political Science, but has been a stalwart in helping us during the workshop, helping us during the academic year as an intern, doing research of all sorts of different topics. And she's hopefully headed to a practice, she thinks, in healthcare law. Let me now turn to Amy and ask for Amy to make whatever comments she wants, either about her educational experiences, how it relates to the topic this evening, or if she wants to add to what Steve may have said already. This is a loose and open conversation, so go in whatever direction you feel you wish, Amy. The virtual podium is yours.
That's quite a charge. Go in any direction I wish on this subject. Thank you for having me, Professor Stein, and thank you for that really interesting introductory lecture, Professor Bayme. So I've been asked to speak primarily from the context of working in Jewish education in the, I guess, the more the non-Orthodox side of the spectrum. So the first thing I want to sort of hone in on from the introductory presentation is this idea from back, I guess, around, decades ago, that our job as an American Jewish community is to support the elected government of Israel. And the way that plays out, the way I've seen it play out in the world of education. And what I'm wondering is if there is space at this point in our history to create an area of education where we can have real, honest wrestling with hard conversations and with the conflicts that we may feel about Israel, without that necessarily being tied to advocacy one way or another, to just sort of create some space between education and advocacy. And then have a whole separate conversation about what to do with that once individuals or communities have done the wrestling, sort of what direction they want to move in from there. In my experience working in classrooms, honest wrestling with hard subjects is the only way to really create this sort of richer and more holistic view of our subject matter that we always want to create. My main area of teaching is Tanakh. That's what my background is in. And typically when I enter a classroom for Jewish learning, what I want is for the kids to relate really personally to whatever we're learning, to dig in and to manhandle it and to ask questions I can't answer and to say whatever hard, true thing they want to say. And I imagine many of us educators have been in classrooms where you've read a hard story in the Torah or you've brought up some difficult subject and you've asked the students what they think, and they say, sure, God can do that because God is all powerful. And you just kind of know that they're not really taking it in. They're not really thinking about it. They're reciting some kind of script that they learned somewhere, certainly not from me, but they think this is the acceptable thing to say. And I would much rather to have a classroom where they're curious and invested and it's messy and we wrestle and we're honest. And then when we come to the end of that process or some pause in that process, there can be that conversation about what to do with all of that. So I don't know if I need to make a case for that kind of personal investment, but maybe in the face of the concern about assimilation and the sort of open marketplace of ideas that we are in the American Jewish community, maybe I do need to make that case. I think that what we can offer our Jewish learners is that kind of deep personal wrestling with subject matter that is meaningful to them. I think we can't start with the assumption that everyone believes already that peoplehood is meaningful, or that Torah is sacred, or that any of the beliefs that I may personally hold. I think we need to, there's an organization out on the West Coast called Jew Belong that does really good work in outreach and really makes the case well that every Jewish person, whether they are incredibly knowledgeable and literate and sort of bought in or not, benefits when we take the time to explicitly build investment in some of these core areas that are so important to the survival and the thriving of the Jewish people, like peoplehood that you discussed. The other thing that I think this kind of wrestling can really give us is the flexibility to change our mind about things over time as our own life experiences change. And I tell children in all areas of Jewish learning, your relationship to prayer will change. So don't expect that whatever you've learned in religious school in second grade is going to take you all the way. It's not going to. And that's okay. And that's good. And that's expected. And I think we should try to offer a foundation in learning about Israel that is nuanced and complex enough that as the situation in Israel changes and as our own life experiences change, that our relationships can change, but it doesn't feel all or nothing. It's not one sort of package of beliefs. That I sometimes feel pressure in the world of synagogue Jewish education to deliver that package. I'll say one last thing about the issue of belonging and making sure that our Jewish students feel that they belong in this conversation. And I know there's a diversity of perspectives about this in the Jewish community in the US and in Israel, but I think it is critical that we continue to advocate for American Jewish voices to have some validity. That doesn't mean we get to decide what the Israeli government does, but that there's value to our voices in this conversation. It is very important to me as an educator, just sort of as an educational philosophy, that our children feel that they're wanted and their perspective is wanted. And I think it's very difficult to invite them into any challenging conversation without that sort of baseline of belonging, which ties directly into peoplehood. I think that belonging before believing is what Mordecai Kaplan said, the founder of Reconstructionism, about peoplehood, which was so central to that particular denomination of Judaism. And I think it is central to this wrestling work also.
Thank you very much. A key point clearly in your remarks was their value to voices, and we need to respect them, which means we have to have open ears and open minds. It sometimes is difficult to do in a social media world when people want to be more closed. So there's a battle there of contemporary America or contemporary world use of social platforms and what
Absolutely.
we're trying to do in our teaching environments. Jay, please provide us with your comments, your reflections on being an undergraduate and also being at Harvard, and also your experience as being a TICFA fellow.
I wanted to make kind of three quick points. I think Steve stole my thunder very much on the first one, so I appreciate that. One of the main things that I wanted to say, both anecdotally and in terms of the data, is that one of the largest and most positively correlated indicators to being in tune with Israel and to being in tune with the issues is being Jewishly involved here in America. And this stat from the Pew survey stuck out to me, and Steve mentioned it briefly, which is that among US Jews married to a Jewish spouse, 93% of them are raising their children Jewish by religion, whereas among US Jews married to non-Jewish spouses, only 28% fall into that same bucket. And it's a 3.5 to 1 or so spread. I think that some of the conversation about American Jewry and its relationship with Israel starts and ends there. Of course, there's tons of nuance that's missing, but there's a really key element, which is just that being involved Jewishly and feeling like you're part of the Jewish people ends up extending to more understanding of and also more empathy with the plight and the sort of situation that Israeli Jews find themselves in. The second point I wanted to make was about the changing nature of who Jews are in America today. Tablet had an absolutely fascinating piece about 3 years ago that really stuck out to me, which is that the population as a percentage of American Jews in Ivy League schools is falling, which is sort of unthinkable to a different era of American Jewry that sort of took for granted the idea that American Jews would constantly be in the elite and sort of always populate the elite ranks of American society. And in that way, I think that there might be some movement away from kind of the elite ideologies that I think play into very much of the anti-Israel sentiment that pervades the United States. And I'm hopeful on that ground, actually, having gone to an Ivy League school and thinking about what I see there. I'm hopeful that American Jews actually sort of not being as concentrated in the Northeast, not being as concentrated in elite institutions, might provide some kind of broad-based understanding, both of their plight here and growing anti-Semitism throughout the country, but also, again, relating more to the sort of situation in which Israeli Jews find themselves. And the last thing I want to say is about why I think that American Jews, especially young ones, are distancing from Israel, and I don't pretend to have any thoughts about how to fix it. It comes down to some kind of central idea, which is that today, being anti-Israel as a sort of ideology is part of a larger package of beliefs that are part of an orthodoxy, in my view, and they all go along with each other. Many of the great thinkers in this area, including Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, and Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the sort of visionaries of intersectionality, voice this much more articulately than I do. But from this point of view, being anti-Israel is only part of a larger nexus of more progressive ideas. And I think part of what Amy is referencing, and I think we can be hopeful about, is that there's a way to separate being anti-Israel from the rest of the ideas, because frankly, I don't think that they are all logically consistent. But I do think that many American Jews who are sympathetic to many of the other ideas that are part of this package often fall in line with or are less critical about the antipathy towards Israel because they see it as part of a broader package that needs to be a cohesive whole in order to make political and ideological sense.
Jackie, please, if you will, take the virtual podium.
So I come into this discussion with a background in Israel advocacy and also Israeli academia from working with ISME, been involved with APAC and received training from a lot of similar groups throughout my high school and college career. It's very fascinating, but also unfortunate to hear Dr. Bayme's analysis of American Jewry's split over the years, but I think it's also interesting that I have seen kind of a microcosm of this occur on Emory's campus. Coming into Emory as a freshman, I would say that regarding Israel, the Emory community at large and the Jewish community especially, Israel wasn't, a major topic on the radar. People cared about Israel, but they weren't necessarily actively promoting Israel. But people certainly would have stepped in if anti-Israel legislation were introduced on campus. So it was pretty apathetic with regards to Israel. However, this changed my sophomore year. There was a spout of anti-Israel activity. And since then, I've seen the Jewish community coming more together in support of Israel. But then I've also seen between my sophomore year and now, more of an anti-Israel sentiment growing across my campus. But this is also representative of kind of the whole, what you see on social media and also throughout the world. And a lot of what I've seen with regard to the conversation on Israel between American Jews, but also at large, is people approach the conflict with a very Western and simplistic perspective. They see the conflict as being Israeli being whites who are oppressors. However, we know this is inaccurate from what we know about the demographic composition of Israelis. And so the way that the conflict has been portrayed can be pretty inaccurate and ignore the actual realities on the ground. I'd also like to talk about how often we see that within the American Jewish community, American Jews, they often face the challenge of having to check their Zionism at the door or rank other issues that are important to them against their Zionism. We can see that with the recent, Black Lives Matter movement, which of course, some of the leaders have made some statements that were anti-Israel, and other groups such as Women's March, other progressive groups. And I think that a lot of groups like that have also hastened the divide between American Jews. And I think another reason for the split in American Jewry could be because the broader split between American Jews and Israeli Jews. It's hard for American Jews to rally in support of Israel if they're not really being connected with the rest, where half of the Jewish community lives 6,000 miles away. And the new president of Israel, Bougie Herzog, documents a lot about this chasm between American and Israeli Jews. And I think one of the things that will help foster this sense of connectivity between American Jews is also fostering the relationship between Israeli and American Jews. And for American Jews to understand that there is this diverse Jewish community, I think that would have a major role on how they view Israel and how they view the conflict, by realizing that, half of Israeli Jews are Mizrahi, not even white, come from or descended from other Arab lands that they were persecuted from. I think that can have a major role in shaping how young Jews actually regard the conflict if they understand a little bit more about Israeli history through interacting with the broader Jewish community around the world.
I'd like to try and tie together a couple of strands of thought. We have a couple of people in the audience who are noting that they either have their own children or they're aware of the fact that we are distant from World War II, we're distant from the 67 war. Jackie, who's going off to law school, was born in 1999, 2000. The knowledge of living through a traumatic event, a trauma, the absence of memory, I think has a great impact on not only physical assimilation, but intellectual assimilation, if I can say that. And yes, there are notations here in the chat that there are kids who are identifying with Jewish organizations that are progressive and left of center. The only suggestion I might have, and then I'm going to ask for all three of you, on how would you treat the issue of the drift of many of our youth. My only suggestion is you have to make a distinction between the political reality or the need for a Jewish state on the one hand, and the politics of the people who run the state on the other. And many students don't know the history, so they're not willing to do that. I'd like to hear your reactions to the question of what do we do and how do we speak to the younger generation? Stephen?
Look, a lot of very important points have been made here, and perhaps the area that I was probably most efficient in is that I sort of took for granted the impact of the establishment is in terms of the young people. Beinart's thesis of the establishment speaks the language of support the government, young people want to hear a language of dissent. And the question then becomes, how should the establishment address these young people? I think the experience I've had in the classroom, specifically on college campuses, and certainly around the dinner table with young people, is that the nature of the discourse is very different in terms of what is the potential impact. Take the controversial issue of West Bank settlements. Left to myself, left to many people I know, West Bank settlements is one of the worst ideas that have ever been set forth. They've been destructive of Israel's place internationally. They've hurt Israel's image. Nothing good comes out of it except creating a demographic disaster, as you alluded to in some of your opening comments. When the AJC debated West Bank settlements, one of the most important comments made by David Harris at that time was that this is not a question about how you or I may feel about West Bank settlements. It's a question of what is the responsible role for a Jewish establishment organization to take with power in Washington. Does Washington need to hear the anti-Israel sentiment that's there anyway, but coming from us, from the establishment, will have much greater impact. And if we don't want that impact to be negative, perhaps our role ought to be more support for the government rather than distancing ourselves from the government. That comment that David made actually 3 decades ago was transformative in terms of the AJC board. The corollary of that, and here's where you get into specifics of young people, is that it then, and it relates also to Amy's comments earlier regarding the validity of American Jewish voices. If we're talking about how we feel as individuals, individual dissent, I would suggest that should only be encouraged. Number one, because the issues are quite controversial. We shouldn't pretend that they're not. Number two, as Amy put it, there's a great deal to be gained by wrestling with the issues rather than saying there's a particular orthodoxy that we all accept. There's a world of difference between individual dissent and institutional dissent. Institutional dissent will carry much greater weight. And the Breckinridge Log example I used earlier of 50 different Jewish organizations with 50 different rescue and relief plans, all working against one another. It's on those grounds the establishment, while it never is opposed to dissent, it generally speaking has not opened the doors as widely as young people might like. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect goes back to some of my opening comments following Danny Gordis, that we're talking about two societies that differ essentially. We are all products of the liberal enlightenment here. And as a result, our values and orientations tend towards American liberalism. Israel undergoes a totally different set of values and experiences and cultures. In that respect, the gap is growing wider. That growing wider isn't necessarily bad if we know how to learn from one another and we know how to exchange with one another. But, and you alluded to this in some of your comments earlier about social media, in the overheated climate of politics today, especially on social media, we are no longer learning from one another. We're throwing brickbats at one another. So in that respect, the conversation with respect to young people, I suggest needs to be founded on these two principles, that there is a world difference between individual dissent and institutional dissent, and dissent is always legitimate if it's done in a spirit of mutual understanding, mutual respect, and a willingness to learn from one another. It's not legitimate and it's not very helpful when it's done in a spirit of say whatever makes you feel good, get it down on social media, and you have 3 million followers for doing so.
Amy?
Yeah, I mean, I really largely agree that there's a big difference between individual and institutional dissent. You know, when you were first articulating your question, Dr. Stein, I was thinking back to a presentation from this afternoon that Michal Lai gave, talking about how she teaches in the context of a day school, a high school. The kids who are in her class are primarily liberally oriented politically, and how she is able to show them where their footholds in Israel are. Like, it might not be the dominant culture in Israel, but there absolutely are organizations where they would feel great kinship and where they would feel that their personal values are reflected. And I think in some ways that alone diffuses so much of the tension. Like, Israel is not a monolith. Like, it's not, yes, there is a government and there are specific concerns for their security that have consequences for how things can run, that Americans may or may not understand in our own context and our own sense of safety in our country. But there are footholds. There are places for us to see ourselves in Israel. We just have to show the kids where they are.
I think that goes also not only for teachers, but it goes for parents as well. They get a kid who wants to go in one direction politically, just have to point out to them that there are other parts of Israel that have great value and of great merit and have great complexity. And just listening to Eli Sperling last night in his presentation on Israeli music, my gosh, how much more complexity and how much more diversity can you possibly have? It's remarkable when you just watch that for 1 hour. You just have your kid take a look at it and say, it's not just about what this or that organization says about the settlements. Jackie, I'd like your response, and then I'll ask Jay if you have anything you want to add to Steve's remarks or to Amy's.
So I'll speak to that. And also, I think this kind of goes a little bit to Elaine's question in the chat too about these more left-leaning Israel organizations. So what I've noticed on a college setting is that a lot of the more left-leaning and even fringe left groups regarding the conflict have created sort of an echo chamber through anti-normalization efforts and not willing to listen to the other side. And so they have this perspective that lacks nuance regarding Israel and the conflict. And in my opinion, the way to get a fuller understanding of the conflict is through learning about all sides. And I think it's important to make it clear to these groups that the best way to advocate for Palestinians and to advocate for Israelis is through understanding all perspectives between all parties and doing the most to help Israelis and Palestinians by learning. And I think a way that we can foster this kind of thinking among American Jewry who disagrees on the conflict is just through, for college students at least, through programming that exposes all different sides of the conflict. And I was lucky enough to have experienced one of these programs when I was in Israel. I got to hear from a right-wing settler, an ultra-Orthodox Jew, extremely left-wing, anti-Zionist, an IDF soldier, an Ethiopian Jew. Just bringing all of these voices together showed me the different perspectives, and I got a better understanding of my thoughts on the conflict and how I can be the best advocate for both Palestinians and Israelis as possible.
Jay?
I think it's difficult to get to some of the concerns of more progressive Jews. I would argue that the pathology that's really made this change is that Israelis and Israel as a state, in sort of dialectical terms, has been coded as oppressive in progressive terms. And I think the key to me to unwinding or at least giving nuance to the relationship between more progressive American Jews and Israelis in Israel is at least breaking through this sort of dogmatic, monolithic, as someone else put, conception of Israel as oppressive. There's a tendency in the package of ideas that I've discussed before to have to code everything as oppressor, oppressive. Catherine McKinnon says M-coded, F-coded. There's different coding for a sort of similar dialectical idea. And so breaking through that epistemological roadblock, I think, is really helpful to getting people to see that, well, there is this nuance, there is this complexity. And like Jackie said, if you can get through the first layer of no normalization, we don't listen, if you push past that one point, I think there's a lot of room to grow. But again, it is challenging, like I said up front, because of that first step, because it's hard to convince people that some organization or entity that they see as coded as being oppressive, however you want to put that, or with whatever word, it's hard to unwind that. But that, I think, has to be the first goal, because in my view, that's where the package of ideas starts. And it's very key to why we've seen this kind of drift that we've been speaking about all night.
It seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there's assimilation in American Jewry that is a rather important dynamic that's unfolding, or has been unfolding for 25 to 35 years. Assimilation has its shortcomings when it comes to identifying either Jewishly or identifying with something that is Israeli. You have in Israel, you have two groups, the Arabs in Israel and the Orthodox in Israel. Leave away the Arabs in Israel for the moment, who basically have achieved a measure of autonomy because the Israeli central government doesn't want to deal with them directly, and didn't want to deal with the Orthodox primarily because they needed the Orthodox in their coalition, or they gave to the Orthodox whatever it is they needed in order to have the Orthodox rabbis stay in control of their movement, and they could be delivered in the Knesset as part of the majority. There seems to be two elements, one in each society, that is demographically pulling at the center. If non-assimilationist Jews, if I can put them in the role of at the center. And the question then becomes here in the United States, because we can't influence what the Israelis are going to do, though, there's a new government in town, and maybe the new government is going to, do things a little bit differently. Maybe that pulling apart between centrist American Jews in Israel will diminish and will slow down. We learned today that the new Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Nachman Shai, in the passing of the power from his predecessor to himself, he took the view that Israel needs to be embracive of all parts of the Jewish religion, and that one of the reasons that distance has grown between Israel and American Jewry or diaspora Jewry is this pummeling of the conservative and the reform, or denying them the opportunity, whatever it is. If you repair enough of the tears in the fiber, then the fiber can rebuild itself. If you don't repair them, then they continue to pull apart. I'm not sure, how do you get to the 28%, Stephen? Well, it's not 28%. 28% have some Jewishness to them. It's another 70% who don't. I'm not sure how you get to that 70%, or I don't know if I'm using the right term. How do you get to? But if we can begin to devise a strategy and a method to have people understand that the state of Israel is relevant for Jewish identity, period, and ask the horrific question, what would be the second greatest tragedy in a century that would befall the Jewish people after the Shoah? And the answer would be the disappearance of Israel. Ask people that question. What does that mean to you as an individual? Not, is Israel important to you, but how will your life change if the Jewish state were not there? And that, I think, is a significant question. It's not something that has an answer, but it's thinking the unthinkable. Steve?
Well, it's a very provocative question, Ken, and I wish we had better answers to it. But right now, the data is not terribly reassuring. 28% are raising their children as Jews. What does that mean? It means the ball game is fluid. You know, we like to think positive outcomes. We have no way of guaranteeing that, but basically, at least they're making that claim. So the remaining 72% are divided into three other camps. Roughly speaking, 30% are raising their children in no faith at all. In other words, that brings it up to from 28 to 58%. Another 20% are raising their children in two faiths, both as Jews and as Christians. Again, we're living in America where the dominant faith is Christianity. And then there's another 30% who are saying that we're raising our children as ethnic, cultural Jews, but not as religious Jews. Now, Judaism is not our faith. Jewishness is our identity. The question becomes, what does that actually mean? If you take a look, for example, this morning's E-Jewish Philanthropy, an important essay by my two colleagues, Sylvia Fishman and Jack Wertheimer, which basically goes through the Pew data indicating that the cultural barometers of Jewish identity simply are not sustaining. They do not stand alone when they've been divorced from Jewish religious life. So you've got a real problem that American Jews are becoming increasingly more secular, increasingly less religious, in notwithstanding the fact America remains a fundamentally religious country. So that we are the most secular of Americans, and the price of that secularity, as persuasive as it may be intellectually, the price of it is diminished Jewish continuity. My own prediction here is not a very sanguine one. It's that we are going to witness an Orthodox ascendancy in Jewish public affairs. That does not mean there'll be an Orthodox preponderance numerically. What it does mean is that a majority of the pool of activists, you know, the people who join the boards of AIPAC, the people who are engaged in pro-Israel advocacy in the decades ahead, a majority of them are likely to be Orthodox. Their views politically are far removed from the views of American Jewry, and for that matter, from American society. So in that respect, if the cause of Israel becomes an Orthodox cause alone, that would be a disaster. What is necessary is the revitalization of the conservative reform movements, and that's why the role of Israel here has not been constructive. That when you have Israelis dissing the conservative reform movements and say, well, we don't care about them anyway because they're doomed to extinction, that is undermining the very basis of pro-Israel advocacy in this country. I also think the Prime Minister himself makes a good number of errors, as was pointed out by Yair Lapid in his address, that he made the cause of Israel into a partisan cause. We need Jews in both parties, active Jews campaigning for Israel in both parties. We're not getting that right now because, again, the liberal base of American Jews has been profoundly alienated by Israel. So when you ask the question, how do we get to that 70%? Number one, some losses are inevitable. Number two, the reason Orthodoxy is doing so well in terms of pro-Israel activity is because the Orthodox look at Israel and they like what they see. We have not done nearly as good a job in presenting Israel to the mass base of American Jewry. And that's where the role of Israel education becomes so critical. And that's what the seminar has been all about. So my hat's off to you for it, but it's going to be a steep uphill climb.
Amy, any comment about what either Jay or Jackie or Stephen have just said?
I was looking at a comment that part of the issue for making Israel relevant to half the families who aren't Jewish is welcoming those kids into some context of Jewish learning. You know, that the way that those children and those families are talked about in the mainstream studies that come out of the Jewish community or the Pew Institute is, I mean, they certainly don't feel like they belong and are a part of this project. And I know that as a teacher, I am always very aware of who are the kids in my classroom who are not even considered Jewish in Israel, who couldn't get married in Israel because of whatever their status is. So like, what am I doing creating a connection for them to a place where they're going to be at a different status? I think that the issue of peoplehood and belonging and who's really at the table is everywhere, is everywhere.
I think that's a very smart statement. Jay, any final thoughts?
I would just respond to Steve quickly, who said that the liberal base of American Jews have been alienated by Israel, and I would agree with it in large part. And I would then pose the follow-up question, which is, what do we do as American Jews, because we can't control basically what Israel does, to change that equation? And one thing that I would hope, and one thing that I have said to Ken many times, and I think is very important, is to keep up the sort of influence and dialogue with the leadership of the Democratic Party and young people who are going to become the leaders of the Democratic Party, because thank goodness Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are excellent friends of Israel, but others in their caucus are not. And so insisting on a dialogue with political leadership, but not just at the sort of septuagenarian level, I think is crucial to sustaining a really strong connection between our country and our country's Jews and those of Israel.
In terms of dialogue with Israelis, and several of you have said quite correctly, Israel has played a role in this distancing. In other words, I say we've played our own role in terms of assimilation, but Israel has distanced American Jews on the grounds that have been noted here. There is a major principle of Zionist ideology that somehow has been forgotten by our Israeli friends. And that is, if Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, which again, regardless of how you feel about the nation state law, most would have signed on to that statement until that law was passed, that the rationale for Israel's existence is to be the nation state of the Jewish people. Anything it does that weakens the attachment of the Jewish people to, number one, Jewishness, or to Israel, undermines its very raison d'etre. For example, further religious legislation. That was advancing an Orthodox monopoly, say, over marriage, as Jay pointed out. Anything along those lines, marriage, conversion, anything that undermines the attachment of non-Orthodox Jews to Israel is undermining the very raison d'etre of Israel as a Jewish state. Now, the flip side of that is that if people like us say that sort of thing here in the States, we have to mean it the other way as well, that anything that undermines the attachment of American Jews to Israel is a bad thing to be doing. And in that respect, yeah, we do a much better job in terms of cementing relations with Israel. Israel needs to live by its own ideology of being the representative nation state of the Jewish people, which means don't do anything that will undermine that relationship. Much of what's been done, especially in religious circles, has served that purpose of undermining.
Do no harm.
Do no harm, exactly.
Keep your ears open, value the various voices, create connections.